Good evening and welcome, everyone. I would like to thank the Public Programs team here at the Exploratorium and the Osher Program Fellowship leadership and my singer, Melissa Cuevas, for inviting me to have the honor of introducing Brother Guy this evening to you. As a fellow astronomer, I want to share that Brother Guy is deeply respected, not only for his outstanding research, but for his extraordinary ability to share the joy of discovery with everyone. He has a gift for making the universe feel both immense but also highly personal. Dr. Consolmagno is a Jesuit brother in the Society of Jesus. He is an astronomer and director emeritus of the Vatican Observatory, where he was appointed by Pope Francis in 2015 and served in that role for 10 years. He is also president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. A native of Detroit, Michigan, Brother Guy earned undergraduate and master's degrees at MIT and a PhD in planetary science from the University of Arizona. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard and MIT, served in the US Peace Corps in Kenya, and taught university physics at Lafayette College before entering the Jesuit order in 1989. Brother Guy is a living expression of the rich tradition of Jesuit contributions to science and astronomy around the world. He has published more than 300 scientific papers, written over a dozen popular science books, hosted radio programs, and as we can see from tonight's work from our colleagues who are doing a documentary, he has appeared in numerous documentaries and television interviews. He has made important contributions to the studies of small objects in the solar system, including meteorites and asteroids. And in the year 2000, the International Astronomical Union honored Dr. Guy Consolmagno by naming an asteroid after him. So now we have in the heavens 4597 Consolmagno, which is one of the asteroids. He is currently the president of the Meteoritical Society, and in 2014 he received the Carl Sagan Medal, very prestigious, from the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences for his excellence in public communication in planetary sciences. Well, now I'm going to share with you how the idea of inviting Dr. Guy Consolmagno came to me. And I have to admit that that inspiration may have had a bit of celestial encouragement. So I was in Rome last May, and I wanted to see astronomy in action inside the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels and the Martyrs. Has anybody been there to the Basilica? Yeah? Okay. So perhaps you remember that this basilica is home of a very remarkable astronomical solar instrument, a solar tracker known as a meridian line. So when I entered the basilica, I saw coming down from the heavens this beautifully collimated beam of sunlight from a tiny little hole up in this very, very high ceiling, projected onto a centuries-old, very long metal line inscribed in the basilica's floor. Now, by tracking the position of the sunbeam along this line, astronomers can tell very precise things about the motion of the sun. For example, we can track the seasons. We can actually measure the length of the solar or tropical year. And we can also verify the calendar, especially the equinox, which is of course related to the date of Easter. All of this with great precision. So as I was there enjoying this beautiful moment in communion with the sun, with this beautiful space, at the confluence of science, art, history, and faith, I thought to myself, if this is not a sign for me to bring the Pope's astronomer to the Exploratorium, I don't know what is. So I took the hint, and here he is. We're lucky to have him tonight. So that moment also reminded me why Brother Guy is such a wonderful fit for the Exploratorium. As you can see from our approach to learning and sharing about science and many other forms of cultural expression, including art and human perception, his approach to scientific exploration exemplifies the joyful curiosity and playful methodology that are the foundations and the future of our own Exploratorium's mission. Tonight, you're going to hear stories from Brother Guy Consolmagno's remarkable life while he continues to explore the bigger questions that have guided his work. What is our place in the universe, and what can the night sky teach us about ourselves? Brother Guy will share how centuries of discovery, debate, and even scientific mistakes have shaped our understanding of the cosmos. Astronomy is one of the few sciences with the possibility that all of us, every one of us, can actually simply step outside and look up and become part of that experience, making this an invitation not just to learn about the stars, but to see our own place among them. Please join me in welcoming Brother Guy.
Thank you very much.
So much. Welcome.
Grazie. It's such a delight to be here. I love science museums. I grew up near the Science Museum at Cranbrook. That was a place I could ride my bicycle to. And I first saw the Exploratorium years ago when it was in your old quarters. It is so marvelous to be here with you guys tonight. Thanks for having me. Let me start by pointing out I'm an observer, among other things. We have a telescope in Arizona, and for about 20 years ago, I was part of a program with a couple of other astronomers to measure the colors, just red, green, blue, of the trans-Neptunian objects. These are the guys orbiting out beyond Neptune. They're small, they're faint, they're about 20th magnitude. So the faintest, the bright star, a star of the first magnitude, we call a first magnitude star. A fifth magnitude star is the faintest you can see with the naked eye. 100 times fainter than that is 10 magnitudes. 100 times fainter than the 10th magnitude star is 15th magnitude. 100 times fainter than 15th magnitude, 20. You get the idea. These are very faint. You need a big telescope to see them. We spent, about 10 years just gathering data, 5 objects for every run, 2 runs a year, until we saw this interesting pattern that all of the really red ones seem to be in these very cold orbits. Now, even though we had a pretty decent-sized telescope, that's our telescope in Arizona, and that's where it's located, near Safford, far away from any of the city lights. Even though it's a beautiful telescope, about a 2-meter telescope, we could only get to about 22nd magnitude. Does this pattern hold to fainter objects? So 20 years ago, we got time on the Keck telescope in Hawaii, the biggest telescope in the world then and arguably now. It's a glorious machine. It's on Mauna Kea at about 15,000 feet. And since you only are given one night, they paid our way out to Hawaii and allowed us to go halfway up the mountain to a little town called Waimea, where we were working in this building where you can see the telescope off in the distance. Now, one of the advantages there, of course, is right across the parking lot is a McDonald's, so you could go get, burgers at midnight while you're observing. We never got that far. We called up the people at the top of the mountain, and they said, it's snowing. So our one night was wiped out. We did get to go back later, but that's different science. But we drew straws. One of us stayed up unless the weather cleared. It didn't. The other 2 of us went to bed. I wake up the next morning, and it suddenly dawns on me, it's Sunday. And I'm a good Catholic boy, but I'm a brother. I'm not a priest. I'm not ordained. I can't just roll out of bed and say Mass for myself. Well, I figure if they've got, a McDonald's, maybe they've got a Catholic church too. So I look it up, and sure enough, there is this lovely Catholic church just up the road, Ascension Catholic Parish. So I show up for the 8:30 Mass, and the pastor comes out, and he says, do we have any visitors? Of course, it's Hawaii. And everybody who's a visitor, stand up and introduce yourselves. Oh, and you're from California, and you're from Ohio. And he goes down, I'm the last one. And so he says, and sir, where are you? And I go, well, I'm an observer from the Vatican. I've been waiting to use that for years. In fact, who am I? I was a Sputnik kid. I was born in '52, which meant that I was in kindergarten, 5 years old, when Sputnik launched. That was me practicing my glare for when I became a professor. Like all little boys in that time, I was going to be a nerd. I was going to be a scientist or an engineer. You couldn't tell the difference. I discovered engineers built things, and I was terrible at that, so I figured I'd be a scientist. Then I went to the Jesuit high school, and all of the smart kids did Latin and Greek, so I figured I'd better do Latin and Greek, and gave up the idea of being a scientist. Turns out, if you know any high school kids who are interested in science, Latin and Greek are really useful for when you're a scientist. Latin because there's so much of the logic of the language that treats you, teaches you how to absorb and dissect the universe the way that you would parse a complicated Latin sentence. And Greek because that's the only place you're ever going to learn how to make those little squiggles that are in half your equations. I went off to Boston College for a year thinking that maybe I'd do a history or but my best friend was at MIT. MIT had the world's largest collection of science fiction, and so I transferred. That was me, 1974, the year I graduated. That was the 70s, Thank heavens I don't have the picture here of the trousers that were sort of plaid and bell-button. It was bad news. I loved it. I fell in love with science. I actually even got to be pretty good at it. I wound up going to the very first program in the world of planetary sciences at the University of Arizona, got my doctorate in '78, came back to Boston, and then spent 2 years as a postdoc at Harvard, 3 years as a postdoc at MIT. Sounds impressive? How many academics are there in this room? You all know 5 years as a postdoc means couldn't get a job. I was 30 years old. I'd lost my way in science. Yeah, I was in the big leagues, but I was a utility infielder, and I'd forgotten why I wanted to do science. Every day I'd walk across the Harvard Bridge to go to my office in that skyscraper, which was called the Green Building, and it's not green, but that's MIT for you. At night, I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling and wonder, why am I doing astronomy? Why am I writing papers about the moons of Jupiter that only 5 people are going to read, and 2 of them are my enemies? Why am I doing this when there's people starving in the world? I couldn't answer that. So I figured there's no problem so big you can't run away from it. I decided to quit science and join the Peace Corps. That's me when I was a whole lot skinnier and not nearly as gray. And the crazy thing, I went there saying, I want to help people, show me where I can help people the most. I thought I'd be teaching up country. I was there with 75 other volunteers who were all teachers. And they took a look at my degree and said, no, actually, you're going to be teaching astrophysics to graduate students at the University of Nairobi. I could have done that in Boston. But every weekend, I go up country with a handful of slides. Remember slides? Yeah. There are slide projectors that run off car batteries that these schools would have. And so I'd show pictures from NASA missions, and then I had this little telescope. Of course I had a little telescope. I'm a nerd. I brought a little telescope with me, and everybody in the village would come on, line up, and look at the craters in the moon. How many people here have ever seen the craters of the moon in a small telescope? Pretty amazing. How many of you have ever seen the rings of Saturn in a small telescope? Okay, how many of you who have seen the rings of Saturn have ever seen the rings of Saturn and not gone, oh, wow? And everybody in the most rural, remote parts of Kenya went, oh, wow. And it dawned on me, I had a very clever cat in those days, much better at being a cat than I could be. But my cat never wanted to look through the telescope. My cat wasn't curious about what's out there, how does it work, what does it mean? But every human being I encountered anywhere in the world has looked through a telescope, has gone, oh wow, to see the rings of Saturn. Because that's what makes us human and not just well-fed cats. Because yes, we need to feed our stomachs, but We don't live by bread alone. I'd read that someplace. It inspired me to go get a teaching job at a little place called Lafayette College, and I fell in love with teaching so much that after a few years I thought I would become a Jesuit with the idea that I could teach physics and astronomy at a Jesuit school like USF or Santa Clara. And then I said, well, the Jesuits are priests, and I'm a nerd. I would make a really terrible, terrible priest. What do I mean? I mean, if you came to me with your problems, and I'd listen to you, and I'd look at you, and like a typical nerd, I'd say, have you ever been to the Apple store, and you tell the genius what you want, and the answer you get is, why would you want to do that? And you tell me your problems, and I'd say, why would you have those problems? You're an idiot. Of course you're going to have problems. Life is tough when you're stupid. I'm told that is not good pastoral care. But Jesuits have brothers. And I figure, as a brother, yeah, I can live with the Jesuits, but I can teach at a university. I entered the order in 1989, took my vows in 1991, spent a couple of years learning some more philosophy, and then I discovered the trick. Jesuits have 3 vows, even the brothers. Poverty, well, I'd been a grad student, I was used to that. Chastity, well, I'd been a grad student, I was used to that. Obedience, I was not used to. Instead of getting a wonderful job at USF, under obedience, without asking me my opinion, they ordered me to go to Rome, eat that terrible food, look at that miserable scenery, live in this drafty old palace that happens to have 1,200 meteorites, and my specialty had been meteorites. And under obedience, I had to obey. And the worst was finally in 2015, when Pope Francis, under obedience without asking me, ordered me to be the director of the Vatican Observatory. Every Christmas, all of the heads of the different departments of the Catholic Church meet in an audience with the Pope. Francis would usually use that as a time to yell at you for being too worldly. And you had assigned seating. You know, the cardinals are in the front row, the bishops are in the second row, and way in the last row, that's me. But I'm in the room. All of this really raises the question, if I'm an observer from the Vatican, why does the Vatican have observers? Why does the Pope have an astronomer? And why would it be me as a Jesuit being called to that? Well, the Jesuit order is kind of an interesting order. It was founded in the mid-1500s by a fellow named Ignatius of Loyola. He'd been a soldier. He got his leg broken in a battle, and while he was recovering, he had these "what am I doing in the world when people are starving" sorts of moments. And in his autobiography, we read the greatest consolation he received was gazing at the sky and the stars. And he did this often, for a long time. It's interesting, when you talk to people about looking at the sky, you get 2 reactions. This is one of them. The sky and the beauty of the stars pulls you out of yourself, puts all of your life in perspective, and is wonderfully beautiful. The opposite is, oh my God, look at all the stars, I'm so dirty. There's a dentist I know in Tucson. Tucson's got a lot of astronomers. He decided to put up pictures of galaxies in the back of his waiting room, and everybody says, I'm scared enough going to the dentist, but looking at nebulae terrifies me. He was not terrified. He founded this order at the University of Paris with a bunch of fellow nerds. So all of these guys had way too much education for their time. And I just want to quote something from one of the classic bits of spirituality. And at first it just seems like a lot of pious, we're created to praise God, and the things of the world are there to help us praise God, and use the things that help you praise God, and be indifferent to the things that don't. You don't condemn them, you just say, okay, it doesn't work for me, but somebody else, maybe they'll work for them. Notice this emphasis on things and the phrase, to find God in all things. Christianity, in particular, but all of the books, all of the religions of the book, have this idea that the physical universe is the expression of God, the creation of God, where we encounter God. And that means the physical universe is a good place. And studying the physical universe can be seen as a religious act. That turns out to be really important when you're trying to get a society behind the fact that we're going to be doing something as useless as worrying about the moons of Jupiter. Every logical system is based on assumptions, axioms. You know, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, or 2 parallel lines will never meet. And sometimes you can relax those axioms and come up with your non-Euclidean geometry. What are the assumptions that everybody makes before they can do science? First of all, that the universe is real. I'm not just dreaming this. You know, I'm not just a butterfly dreaming that I'm a philosopher. I've got to believe that the world operates by laws. It's not a bunch of nature gods. You know, the nature god theory could explain everything perfectly, but has no predictive power. If I decide there are no nature gods, then I still have the question, well, why did the lightning bolt go there? Why did this plant grow here? But most of all, I have to believe that simply knowing about the universe and how it works is a worthwhile thing for a grown-up to do, even if it's not going to put food in your stomach, even if it's not going to make you rich and famous, because those aren't the goals. The goals are simply understanding the truth. Pope John Paul II had this marvelous encyclical about faith and reason, and he starts with the picture, faith and reason are the wings that left us to the truth. Very pretty words. He's saying that faith and reason are equals. If one wing overdoes the other, the bird falls over. And he says that neither faith nor reason are the goals. They're the tools. Truth is the goal. So you're not, you know, our goal isn't just make everybody Catholic, if that doesn't lead you to God. Our goal isn't to make everybody a scientist, if that doesn't actually lead you to the truth. If the physical universe is good, then studying the physical universe is good. Now, there's a long history of church science. I just will point out our own observatory was founded by the previous Pope Leo XIII, the same guy who wrote an encyclical saying, you know, in favor of labor unions. And within a few months of when he wrote that, he wrote this, establishing the Vatican Observatory to show the world that the church supports science. And I could go off on a tangent for a long way of why people would think otherwise. I mean, most science was done by the clergy until about the middle of the 19th century. Who else had the education and the free time, you know, to go gathering leaves and sorting and filing them? The observatory today, the one I'm working for, will have, you know, this is last week, we had a series of lectures on quantum gravity with, you know, some of the great cosmologists of the world. We've had a few Nobel Prize winners, you know, visiting us, working with our people. My own work, when I'm not at the telescope, involves meteorites. You drop a meteorite in liquid nitrogen, you see how much nitrogen is boiled off until the meteorite reaches liquid nitrogen temperature. You know how many grams were boiled off. You know the difference in temperature, and the amount of boil off tells you the heat capacity of the meteorite. And in this way, we can measure heat capacities without breaking the meteorites up. Collecting the data on the physical properties of meteorites is what I've been doing for the last 25 years when I'm in the lab in Castel Gandolfo. And then when I go to, you know, Tucson, I would use the telescope. Plus, you get to handle meteorites. Rocks from outer space, 4.5 billion years old in your hand. And you get to play with liquid nitrogen too, which is even more fun. Having a Vatican observatory has some other adventures attached to it. Now, this was the IAU meeting in 2006, And the woman there is Jocelyn Bell Burnell, one of the most respected astronomers in the world, and she's holding Pluto. Because this was the big debate. The final definition was written by the fellow in the middle, who, though he's wearing a coat and tie, is actually another Jesuit priest, Father Chris Corbally, who was on the committee that would write these resolutions, because the Vatican is a member nation of the International Astronomical Union. And we wind up doing a lot of work in these different societies because we're not competing with the other scientists for the money. I don't take NASA money, I don't take NSF money, I don't take ESA money. And they think that I'll be more fair when I come up with, decisions about what to do. Incidentally, if there's anybody here who's going to be, oh, you demoted Pluto, I just want to point out, if you think being something other than a planet is a demotion, then you're saying that being a planet is better than being an asteroid or a TNO or a comet. You're guilty of planetism. Heaven forbid. We actually even play a role in politics. In the 2018, we talked about there was the 50th anniversary of the peaceful uses of outer space, something that is really controversial. I was representing the Vatican city-state at the UN. It kind of felt like when I was in Model UN when I was in high school, but there I was. And we all, it was basically 90 nations. A representative got up and read a speech that said, peace is good, space is good. And I read the one that they wrote for me that said, peace is good, space is good. And that was the headline the next day, because it happened to be a few days after the Space Force had been invented in the US. So there I am, suddenly being a controversial, just saying peace is good, space is good. We're very well known in the field of astronomy because, among other things, every 2 years we hold a summer school with 25 really bright students from around the world, no more than 2 from any country, but from every part of the world, every religion or no religion. And we usually get an audience from the Pope. This particular picture was 2018, and I remember it because before the Pope's coming in, a second after this picture is taken, he walks over to me, I'm the director at that point, and says to me privately his condolences because my father had died the week before. And he knew that. My dad made it to 100, so it was a pretty good. But that kind of personal care and interest in astronomy has been true. I just will mention a couple of the, just people who have been in our summer schools. One of our instructors has gone on to win a Nobel Prize, Diderot. Another fellow who was in the 1993 school, Heino Falke, was the guy who made the image of the black hole. We've had some pretty good people at this school. We also produce beautiful calendars that we send to prisoners. And think of this the next time you're outdoors and don't bother looking up. When you're incarcerated, you don't get to see the night sky for years at a time. These pictures can be the only time you get to see that the universe is bigger than the gray walls surrounding you. They're in prison. Are you putting yourself in your own prison by not experiencing the universe? And I get to travel around the world. This was just last August when I was talking to a bunch of kids in the South Island in New Zealand. It's because of this that Pope Leo XIV came to visit our observatory with one of the old telescopes that we still have in Castel Gandolfo. And he wrote, "Science and religion face an insidious threat, those who deny the very existence of objective truth. That's precisely why the Church's embrace of rigorous, honest science remains not merely valuable, but essential." Now, among the many places and many unlikely places where I've spoken, probably the most unlikely was Oral Roberts University. This was in 2019. And I'm thinking, do I know who they're bringing in here? I'm a Jesuit, I'm not really. Different kind of religion from theirs, I thought. The horrible thing was, in fact, they were incredibly nice and, did their best to destroy years of Northern prejudice. But I did talk to a class, and one of the students just looked at me in the eye and said, "Do you take the Bible seriously?" You know, because I'm talking about the Big Bang. The fact that a priest came up with the idea of the Big Bang held nothing for them, because what's in Scripture? And my adventure then was to come up with an answer that's so good that I've stolen it for myself. This is the cosmology of Genesis 1. The world is flat, there's a dome, there's water above and below the dome. I don't think anybody in that classroom believed this cosmology. But here's the interesting thing. This is not Jewish cosmology. This is Babylonian cosmology. Because Genesis 1 was written during the Babylonian captivity. A lot of these students had never heard of that, and I'm thinking, what kind of Bible do you read if you don't know about that? Around the year 600, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, carted off all the educated people to help run their bureaucracy. They're carted off to Babylon. They never know if they're ever coming back. And they're seeing their kids grow up in this culture. And in the culture, they are learning the cosmology of the Babylonians, which is actually just look out the world. You know, look out the window. The world looks flat. There's a dome. It's what you see. But the Babylonians had this creation myth that involved a dragon named Tiamat and a bunch of gods who were fighting each other. And eventually the dragon is killed, and the inside of the body of the dragon becomes the dome of the sky. And for reasons that I can't talk about in a public audience, the bunch of gods do things that make human beings appear by accident. And the human beings are all gathered in the corner, and they say, we're going to sneak up on these gods. We're going to build something that they didn't expect. And the climax of the Babylonian creation story, the place that is the climax of human achievement, is the city of Babylon. And the Jewish parents, seeing their kids learning this stuff, go, no. Here's what we say. We'll take the same cosmology, best science of its day. Yeah, it would be obsolete 100 years later, but they didn't know that. And instead they go, no, in the beginning, God, there's only one God. And it's a God who's there before anything else has been created, which means that the God is outside of nature. And as they probably didn't know, Wittgenstein 2,000 years later would make the point that no thing can have meaning in and of itself. The chair that you're sitting in only has a purpose if there's somebody not chair sitting in it. Likewise, the universe can only have purpose if there's something not universe outside the universe to give it meaning. Just by saying, in the beginning, God, you've already completely changed the way you look about the universe. Said, let there be, the universe occurs not by accident, but because the one God who is supernatural decided to make it happen. It's by the deliberate word of the Creator. And what does he say at first? Light. Nothing is hidden. Nothing is, oh my God, man was not meant to know. And it was morning and evening and morning, the first day. Creation occurs as logically in a pattern as logical as day follows night. Creation is not a bunch of arbitrary whims of a bunch of nature gods. It's one God who wants you to show what he's doing, who wants you to be there to see what he's doing, and who creates in a logical way. Not only that, but every step along the way, God says this is good. There are some religions that will tell you the physical world is a lure of evil. Chocolate was a tool of the devil to make you fat and give you acne. But my religion says chocolate is a foretaste of the goodness of God. It should be treated like a sacramental and respected. But finally, where is the end point of the Genesis story of creation? Where does it all end up? What is the ultimate purpose of creation? What's the last and most glorious thing that God creates? Anybody? Humans are only the sixth day. It's the weekend. It's the day off when you can take a nap. Seriously. God is saying that putting food in your stomach isn't enough, that we are created to contemplate the universe and thereby contemplate its creator. We were made to puzzle and ask, why does that work? That's why coming to the Exploratorium is a religious experience. That was, in fact, commanded to us in Scripture, to keep the Sabbath holy. And people who are forced to work 7 days a week by whatever circumstances are having the heart of their religion ripped away from them. Actually, there's another place in Scripture that I think is really important and equally amazing. And this is way at the other end of Scripture in the second book of Maccabees, where there's an evil king who's trying to get the Jews to eat this poisoned, or this meat that's been dedicated to the pagan gods. And if you're not, then he'll kill you. And there's a mother with 7 sons, and each one by one, is being executed. And when the youngest is about to be executed, Mom says to her, remember, you're worshiping a God who created the universe and didn't even make the universe out of things that already existed. This is the beginning of the principle of creation out of nothing. This is where Leibniz comes up with the idea, why is there something instead of nothing? In an essay called On the Ultimate Origin of Things. Now, to ask why is there something instead of nothing is very different from asking how to get started. So we're going to do a side bit on Einstein. Today's cosmology starts with Einstein's general relativity. The most notable prediction was the way that gravity would warp space in such a way that you could see a beam of light passing near the sun bent in an unpredicted way if you didn't have gravity bending space. In 1919, Sir Arthur Eddington went to an eclipse, saw the position of a star next to the sun slightly shifted from where it was expected to be, announced it, and this is the report in the New York Times, 1919, 10th of November. Men of science, more or less, agog over the results of the eclipses. Einstein theory triumphs. Stars not where they seem to be, but nobody need worry. It's a book that only 12 wise men could understand. I heard all of these cliches about general relativity when I was a kid growing up. All of them date from this one New York Times article, which was written by a sports reporter who happened to be in London and was the only guy that the New York Times had available to send to the... Because Einstein was being reported on as if he was, a football star, that began the myth that, to be a genius, you had to have, crazy white hair and a German accent. But it actually is an interesting point. Gravity appears to be a bending of space-time. Now, if you've got all of these things in the universe with mass that are bending space-time, creating gravity, eventually you'd expect them to all fall into each other. And that hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? Well, that same guy you saw in the other picture with the funny-looking collar is a guy named Georges Lemaitre. He was a Catholic priest from Belgium, and he was a postdoc of Sir Arthur Eddington, the guy who observed that eclipse. And he said, what if the universe started in a very dense, high-energy state, like a cosmic seed, and this energy was enough to cause the universe, space, and time itself to expand and explode? Fred Hoyle, an Englishman, hated the idea, in part because he was English and he hated anything that a priest would say. But he also really wanted the universe to be eternal and unchanging. He, in a 1949 broadcast on the BBC, made fun of Father Lemaitre's theory by calling it his Big Bang theory. Lemaitre and Eddington, and Lemaitre and Hoyle eventually met in person at the Vatican at a meeting about the cosmology. And they became best of friends. Because a true scientist wants to know the truth more than wants to be shown to be right. Because the truth is what we're there for. Now, funny thing, about 10 years ago, Stephen Hawking was really, really worried. Because Stephen, again, being an English elderly white male, I got nothing against elderly white males, being one myself. Let me just point that out. But he really was uncomfortable with the idea of God. And he was trying to figure out, how do I get around this Big Bang? But he and his colleague, this is Leonard Latimer, worked out a theory that actually, he says, allows the universe to create itself. So, you've got the space-time continuum. But because of quantum uncertainties, it will be bopping up and down at any place. And if you wait long enough, we got all the time in the universe, one of those bops up will be big enough to set off the Big Bang. And so he says, because there is a thing called gravity, I don't need God to light the blue touch paper and set things off. Well, there's a couple of philosophical holes in that argument, like where did the space-time continuum come from? Where did the laws of quantum physics come from that would make that happen? But the worst actually is this. Hawking thinks, that whatever started the Big Bang is God. And then he says, gravity started the Big Bang, so it logically follows that gravity is God. Which I don't think he actually wanted to say, I don't think gravity is God, That's not why Catholics celebrate Mass. Let me go someplace else real fast. One thing I do know about astronomy is you wait till it's dark and you look up. So there I was 30 years ago, landing on the blue ice of Antarctica in that plane, going to a place where the sun never set and spending the entire time looking down, looking on the ice for meteorites. That's my home. It was for 6 weeks. Our frozen food was back there. There was a little solar power. You'd go upwind to collect ice and melt it to live. And then once a day, we'd get in our skidoos and go back and forth across the blue ice. Meteorites fall everywhere, but when they land in Antarctica, number one, they don't rust. Number two, they're really easy to find because they're black and the meteorites are, and the ice is white. But also, the ice gathers together. It flows downhill, so there's almost like a conveyor belt bringing meteorites together. This was one that we found that turned out to be a piece of the moon. That little bit of white there, that's actually a crevasse. You don't step on that. That's not just snow on the ice. One of the exciting things we did in the 6 weeks we were there was waiting to get home. We had a snowstorm. When it's cloudy, you don't have any shadows, and the sky is the same color as the snow, and you can't even see where you're walking. We had a 10-day, sitting in the tent, do nothing but eat Cadbury's chocolate bars and read War and Peace until the wind blew the snow away and we could go back out again. And then on the day after Christmas, we went to be picked up, and this kind of weather was coming in. There were going to be 2 planes to pick us up. The first one landed safely, and half the crew, including me, got on. But we had loaded it up with all of our equipment, and the plane was having a hard time taking off because it's got just skids on the snow. And the pilot saw a ridge of snow and went so that found just long enough that we were able to get home. Wow. The next plane starts circling around, and these are the conditions. So they're talking by radio to the guys waiting to be picked up and the second crew. And they finally said, I'm sorry, we cannot see where the ground is. It's too dangerous to land. We're going to have to turn around. Oh, we just hit the ground, never mind. And so they were able to get home as well. I did finally get to visit in a place where it was dark, New Zealand. after we came back. The first night I remember looking for the Southern Cross, and it was upside down because it's circumpolar. I was staying at a bed and breakfast with a bunch of other tourists, including a family from Germany. And I had had some high school German, so I'm chattering away with them. And they go on their way, and 2 days later, the woman running the bed and breakfast says, "Would you like to go to church with us?" This is the little church in Lake Tekapo in New Zealand, now a dark sky resort, a beautiful place. 1 week it's Catholic, the next week it's Episcopalian, the next week it's Presbyterian, and they just sort of cycle through. And she said, if you go to church, maybe you can help this woman who is, you probably heard about, a different German tourist. She and her husband were climbing the Southern Alps. He stepped back to take a picture, and she saw him fall to his death. She's going to be at the church now. I'm a Jesuit, and I can speak German. Oh my goodness, exactly. I remember, I'm a nerd, right? I don't know how to talk to people like this, right? I told God I'll do a deal where I'll be a brother so I won't have to. What I did learn is you don't talk, you listen. And the Anglican priest, gave me a couple of things to start with. But it reminded me that the science is more than just collecting the meteorites, more than just collecting the data. It's dealing with people. People who are faced with their own cosmology. Being at the Vatican Observatory, I find myself now talking to lots of people, just like in this room. The Vatican had me one time participate in a series of TED Talks. And the great thing was, the day after the TED Talk, those of us who were presenters were allowed into the Sistine Chapel half an hour before the tourists got there, which was amazing. And I got to meet some of the other presenters. So I did the tour next to this little short Cuban lady whose English was fine, so we were chatting away. Afterwards, somebody pointed out, you realize that was Gloria Esteban. But stargazing has become very popular as a theme for religious retreats. I was giving one in Enders Island, Connecticut, when a woman who works for exhibitions with Johns Hopkins and the Space Telescope Institute was there. And we got talking, and she said, wouldn't it be great if we could have an exhibit of space imagery at the Vatican? So we put that together. And I just want to show you some of the pictures we wound up with. Now, some of these pictures are on posters outside. The thing to note is that the posters are higher resolution than what you see here. Go back to those posters when you leave. Put your nose right up to it, and you won't see the little dots that are on these screens. What you will see is this enormous collection of beauty. I could give you a science lecture on every one of these pictures. Every one of them, to me, has a series of stories. What I learned about when I was in school, the people I knew who were involved in them. And yet, there's also, at the very end, the sheer beauty of it. There's a subtle image here. All of these, the pictures that are coming from the web are done in the infrared. That infrared light allows you to see through clouds so that the web picture on the right of the same object as the Hubble picture on the left, you can see much more detail. The colors with which we see the farthest, the most redshifted galaxies, again, they're in the infrared because those are the ones farthest away, the ones that show us the beginning of the universe. Our images have to reinterpret the colors. Microwave colors become red. The nearer infrared ones, just beyond our eyesight limit, we color blue. And we're used to that because that's called poetry. To use words that we do understand to express things that are sometimes beyond what words can express. Dante talked about a universe, a world that had, boiling hell and brimstone beneath it. So does the moon of Jupiter. These images remind us that the universe is filled with beauty. They delight the eye. You don't need to study a whole lot to appreciate them, but the more you study, the more you can find beauty. Because not only are they beauty, the science behind them is beauty. And it is in this beauty that we're reminded that the glory of creation reflects the magnificence of the Creator. Psalm 19 says that. The heavens declare the glory of God. But with these images, the heavens are declaring things that the psalmist could never have imagined. Even better, anyone looking at them can taste the joy that we get to taste as astronomers when our telescopes capture the cosmos and touch the face of God. And that's the greatest adventure of all. Thank you so much for coming.
Woo! Wow. What a journey. I'm actually really curious, sort of how many of you in the audience feel like the juxtaposition of the science and the religion is comfortable? I want to see a hand raise. Okay. And I also want to see a hand raise for how many of you think it's not comfortable. Yeah, fair amount. So I find that we're in a fascinating time right now where some people find that very natural and some people find it hard. And so it's very interesting to me. I'm very interested in science and religion. I work here at the Exploratorium. I've been here 21 years. I happen to have grown up in Rome, Italy. Actually, my father was an artist. He was a sculptor who moved there to study sculpture for 6 months and then never left. So to me, that combination feels natural, but and that's part of why I chose to work at science museums. But I also think in this time, it feels a little bit hard for some people. And I guess I would like you to reflect on why is it that for some people it's the most natural thing in the world, and for some people it's like, it's scary.
Well, both of them are scary. Science is scary, religion is scary, because both of them pull you out of yourself and make you force you to think that the most important thing in the world is not where's the refrigerator and what's for lunch. But a lot of it, too, is the way that we teach science and the way we teach religion. I had this interesting conversation with, of all people, William Shatner. Can I drop a name? He was well in his, he was looking at me like, "Wait, a Jesuit and a scientist? How can that be? Wait a minute. He always would say, wait a minute. I'm not quite sure why. But talking to him, I realized in his brain, science is a big book of facts, and religion is a different big book of facts. And oh my gosh, what happens if this book doesn't agree with that book? One of them's got to be thrown away, and I'll put my faith in science. Thank you very much. And that's the way we teach science, at least into high school. You pass the course by getting the answers in the back of the book. But what we're teaching there isn't science any more than playing scales is playing music. And that's the way we teach religion. Get the right answers. Again, that's not what it ought to be. Both of them should be a love relationship. I love the universe. I'm always learning new things about the universe, even things that I thought I knew before. Just as a good friend, you're constantly learning new things about. And I hope that's what you're doing with God. If you think you got God already figured out and it's already in that book and that's all there is, well, I'd hate to see what your marriage looks like.
Ooh. The idea that study and inquiry is love feels very, very comfortable to me working at the Exploratorium. I think what we're doing with every exhibit is we're trying to create a window into inquiry, a window into just asking questions, but not necessarily expecting the textbook answers. I'm curious sort of to hear more about inquiry in both scientific context, but also in religious context. You're a Jesuit. The Jesuits actually have practices of inquiry
Yeah.
for a spiritual practice. And I'm just curious how you think about inquiry itself in both of those domains.
You can't learn without inquiry. But you can't learn anything if you don't ask a question about what you're trying to learn. But you can't ask that question without admitting ahead of time you don't know the answer. And that's the key to being a scientist or to being a person whose faith is going to grow. There are cultures, and we can think of several of them, where it's very embarrassing to admit you don't know the answer. I had a Japanese-American friend who had gone back to Tokyo to visit grandparents and asked a taxi driver, do you know how to get to such and such? And rather than the driver saying, I don't know, let me find out, he was embarrassed to say he didn't know. He'd just go, very difficult. Well, it's very difficult if you don't admit you don't know. And it's not just Japan, it's lots of cultures have that. A lot of American culture is, I refuse to admit that maybe I was wrong. The old joke, I thought I was wrong, but I was mistaken. But you can't be a scientist without being open to the fact that maybe I'm wrong. And being wrong doesn't mean totally off base, but just what I knew was right, but it was incomplete. I'll give you an example. I'll answer a question that I haven't heard asked, but has there ever been a time when my religion said one thing and my science said another, and my gosh, what do I do? And actually there hasn't been, because they're really not talking about the same things. The religion is more meta compared to science. It's why I feel brave enough to do science. But what does happen, if you're lucky, is this bit of science contradicts this other bit of science. And when that happens, you go, all right, I'm going to get a paper out of this. I'm about to learn something new that I didn't know before. So even if you do come across these contradictions, it's not a reason to despair or to panic. It's a reason to get excited because you're learning something new.
Okay, so that's true in science. Is that also true in religious inquiry?
It has to be. It has to be. I'll run it this way, sort of inside out and backwards. Science is trying to describe the universe, which is probably bigger than any of us can actually completely understand. But we can have human-made theories, which some of us at least can understand, that approach explaining the universe. So science is understanding approaching truth. It doesn't always get there, but if you do it right, it's getting closer and closer all the time. And that's why it's fun. Now, religion says, I'll give you these truths, but you're not going to understand them. I mean, a religion that was completely understandable would be pretty shallow, would have no room for growth. And you only do understand them by living with them for a while. There's a famous story in Scripture of Jesus, 12 years old, goes off in the temple, gets lost. 2 days later, he shows up, and his mom's going, where were you? What were you doing? And Jesus has this pat answer. And Mary is going home thinking, what is this kid? In Scripture, we are told Mary goes home and ponders these things in her heart, which makes her a scientist, a poet. She doesn't sit down and write a 3-volume volume of Christology trying to explain it all. No, you encounter something that doesn't make sense, but you know is real, and you just live with it for a while. I think it was John von Neumann at MIT who said, you never understand mathematics, you just get used to it. And I think that's true of religion. I think that's true of the physical sciences.
So when you talk about truths, when you talk about the power of truth in both science and in religion, you said that actually Pope Leo was talking about that, right?
Yeah.
How do you deal, like, I think I joked with you actually in one of our earlier conversations. I joked, rocket science is really quite easy compared to human science. So when you deal with the messiness of just one human being, you even talk about a relationship, right?
Yeah.
When you deal with the messiness of love and of the darker sides of humanity as well, how does one look for truths there? How does one inquire into those mysteries in a way that is both scientific and religious?
I think you can only do it in a community of people, because your own set of eyes are always going to be biased. Your own instincts of right and wrong are always going to have a systematic error built into them based on who you are and where you're coming from. So you need a community of people to talk to, people whom you trust, even though you know they're biased too. It helps if you have an idea of where their biases are. But it means the broader the community that you have to speak with, the more, dare I say, diverse you have of a community together. You can then plot all of your ideas and hope that the truth is somewhere in that cloud of data points. And though it won't be exactly in the center, it will give you a sense of which way to look, or maybe where we're all being pulled systematically away from the truth. Science is not, the stuff in a book. And science is not done by Doc Brown in his garage building a time machine. It's a it's a conversation with people. And the first thing I remember when I was a kid, my folks at the summertime would sit around a fire, drink beer, and talk about everything under the sun. And we kids would kind of hide in the shadows to overhear them. Half the time, no idea what they're talking about, but it just sounded really cool. You spend time listening to the conversation, waiting for the moment when you have something you think you can add to it. That's what graduate school is spending time listening to the conversation, finding out what's the language. When they use these words, this is what they mean. And that takes a long time. Look, every scientist will get crazy letters. Used to be written on onion skin paper in very, very tiny letters, and now they're in emails with all caps. But they're the people who have, want to get in on the cool thing of being a scientist, but haven't had the opportunity to be part of the conversation. And my heart goes out to them, even as I hit delete. Because I know that they know they're missing something, because they haven't had the chance to be part of that conversation. That has to be true as well with a religion. I think that's, people say, you're at the Vatican, you're a planetary scientist at the Vatican. How can you deal with it? And I admit I'm dealing with a bureaucracy that's big and cumbersome and seems to be run by idiots who seem to get in their own way and not do the best thing they could do. But the reason I put up with it is that NASA is, at the end of the day, the only group that got us to the moon. You thought I was talking about a different bureaucracy? And it is in the nature of bureaucracies to be cumbersome and slow, but also to preserve. I'm in my 70s now. What cool things I've discovered, if any, can only be passed down because there are universities and journals and scientific societies that will outlive me. I think the same is true in religion. For all that you roll your eyes at the church and everything goofy it does, because, hey, we're human beings. They say that the fifth proof of the existence of God is the fact that the church has survived human beings for 2,000 years. And yet, we goofy human beings somehow continually stumble closer and closer to the truth. When I became a Jesuit, they made me take philosophy. I took a philosophy of science class, which makes me an expert now because I took one class. What I did learn was there's a whole lot of reasons why science shouldn't work, and yet somehow it does. For all of the ways that we could go wrong, there's something in the way the universe is put together that drives us, that converges closer and closer to the truth. And I find that very encouraging.
Well, speaking of conversations, some that have been going on for 2,000 years within bureaucracies, some that are actually here in this room. I know that many of you have written questions, and somebody is going to give me some questions. So speaking of the conversations, we want to broaden this a little bit, and if we have some questions being gathered. I get to ask one more? Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
because they've got to go through and find the
That's
hardest ones to have me read.
That's right, exactly. The ones that will really
Right.
stump you.
Yes.
Okay, well, what do I want to ask? I guess I am curious. I feel like we talked a lot about history, and the supposed warfare between science and religion was really an invention in the late 19th century. Wasn't the case for Newton. It wasn't the case for Maxwell. They were all profoundly religious people. They would have been completely confused if you had told them that there was a conflict between science and religion. But things did happen in the end of the 19th century that started some kind of a wedge. You said that now recently scientists are coming up to you and that they no longer believe that conflict narrative as much, some of them.
Yeah.
I still find plenty of them that do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, what do you think the future of that relationship is going to be?
Well, there's a couple of things happening. One is that science and religion are two of the last remaining places where we still believe there is an objective truth, rather than truth is whatever we decide we want it to be, which is far more convenient for people living in the crises of the moment. And we find ourselves both defending the search for truth. So we're on the same side there. Another thing that has changed is, I'll go back to diversity. Not only, I mentioned that meeting that when Georges Lemaitre met Fred Hoyle. There's a big photograph of everybody at that meeting. And number one, they're all men. Number two, they're all white men. Number three, they're all white men with names that don't end in vowels. There's not even a Consolmagno there.
Oh, dear.
20 years later, I'm in graduate school. One of my fellow grad students is here. How many women were in our class of 11? One woman. How many Catholics? 2 Catholics. How many Jews? Half a Jew. It was still pretty darn waspy vanilla. It isn't the case anymore. What I find now is that back then I wasn't particularly, broadcasting my religion for fear of what people would think. Now it's, I've got a friend who's a Muslim, and I've got a friend who's a Buddhist, and I've got a friend who's and it's a point of pride to be able to say, I've got this diversity, which also means in some way they're not taking it as seriously, and that's the downside of it. There are still people who think that your choice of religion is like your choice of coffee. Are you a Pete's guy or a Starbucks guy? But there is this openness to that. The other thing that's happened, well, part of this is in the Midwest. I did a bunch of talks in February, March, to a number of schools in the Midwest. Purdue, you don't think of Purdue as a hotbed of religion. But the hotbed of engineering, absolutely. The Catholic chaplaincy on a weekday is packed, mostly with engineers. Michigan Tech, out in the middle of nowhere in northern Michigan, surrounded by wilderness in every direction. As my brother lives nearby in Marquette, and as they say, we're not near a big city. We're not even near Duluth. And their chaplaincy is filled in a way that it wasn't 5 years ago. I think this might be a reaction to COVID and the attack on truth that came with COVID and the desire for community that came with kids who were in their junior high going through COVID. And also a sense that the old system of finding meaning isn't enough.
And by old, do you mean 20th century old?
The 20th century, the up to 2015. The sense that a better computer. My meaning of life is to get the latest iPhone, which incidentally I love the iPhone. Don't get me wrong. My religion now. But the difference between the Protestants and the Catholics and the world of PCs and the world of Macs. Old story. The Protestant religion was originally based on people who were based on nothing but the word. No pretty pictures, no incense. And that, of course, was DOS. But it was divided into a bunch of competing different DOS. Whereas Apple...
Steve Jobs was not Catholic.
but he was the Pope. He was the Pope in Cupertino, and everybody had to follow him. And then Windows came along, and Windows, of course, was the Episcopalians, because it was based on the one, but it looked like the other. Until somebody pointed out that all of them underneath have Unix, and that's Judaism.
Oh, boy. It's a good thing I've got some other questions here to save me. Okay, starting at the top here. Thank you all, by the way, for the questions. I've encountered non-believers who are good at explaining how the universe came to be, but I perceive that they lack the awe or wonder in the fact that it is incredible, that the universe, or even we, exist at all. What would you say to someone that may be lacking wonder?
Yeah, because, I mean, the theological or the philosophical point is there's a difference between how did it happen and why did it happen at all in the first place. If you're not feeling awe and wonder, if you're writing a poem and it's going wrong, if you're painting a picture and it's just not right, you're putting the notes together and the music's just not right and it's not just a northern song, it's because you know instinctively there's something missing. The hardest part about being a scientist, as anybody here who does science knows, is not doing the science. It's choosing a problem that's big enough to be interesting, small enough that you can actually make progress on it, and then guessing of 5 different ways to approach it, what's going to be the most fruitful. And the way you do that is which one instinctively feels the most elegant. Which one brings you closer, faster, to that sense of awe, that sense of wonder. You have to have that of, even if you don't believe in God, you've got to believe in, oh my God. And if you don't have that, oddly enough, you're not going to succeed as a scientist. And even if you do, you'll wind up with some kludgy answer, which is terribly inelegant, and will be superseded probably by somebody in 5 years' time, which is true in any case. So it can't be the answer that you're working for. It's got to be that sense of awe.
So even profoundly atheist scientists like Hawkins and I don't know how you pronounce his name,
Latimer.
Latimer.
Okay. Yeah. A good Polish name. I came from Detroit.
But they're driven by awe.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And when
so you can be an atheist and be driven by awe.
Oh well, but Hawkins wasn't an atheist.
Oh, okay.
He just didn't want to admit he believed in God. And of course, anybody, I can find probably 5 people who are ready to throw things at me because that's deliberately meant to be provocative. But if you believe in truth, Hawkins or Sagan, none of these people would promote a scientific theory that they knew was wrong, but they thought they could get away with until they died. No. Because that's not playing the game. That's not satisfying. That's not truth. But if you believe in truth, you're believing in something more than material. You're believing in some kind of transcendental. And certainly I think that's a kind of God. What's more, the God they say they don't, this is a Jesuit named Michael Buckley makes this wonderful point writing about atheism. And he says, to be an atheist, you have to have a very clear idea of the God it is you don't believe in. Otherwise, how can you be sure you don't believe in him? And more often than not, the gods they don't believe in, I don't believe in either. I feel much closer to my friends who say they're atheists than I do to friends who believe in a kind of religion that I think is just total bunkum.
We could keep going all night.
Oh, yeah.
All right? Okay. So given your faith and your professional identity, how do you feel about the church's history of excommunication of scientists? Ooh, we're going to go there. We're going to
yeah, who did they excommunicate? Well,
Yes.
there's Galileo, who actually
Was
didn't
not
excommunicate. And then there's Galileo, who they didn't actually excommunicate. And who else, I guess? Oh, Giordano Bruno, yes.
They burned him, yeah.
Yeah, they did burn him. Of course, the reason they burned him had nothing to do with his science, because the science that he was promoting had actually been pronounced by a cardinal 200 years earlier named Nicholas of Cusa. So he was probably actually burned for plagiarism. But where do we get the idea that the church, was anti-science? It comes from the 19th century. It comes from a couple of how many people here brought up in America, first of all, because it turns out this doesn't work in Europe. How many of you brought up in America were taught that Christopher Columbus proved the world was round? You remember being taught that? Certainly the older people. Well, obviously it's bunk, because he didn't even make it around the world. So how did he prove anything? Furthermore, everybody knew the world was round going back to the ancient Greeks. That myth was invented in a book by Andrew Dixon White called The Eternal War Between Science and Christendom. He went on to found Cornell, so if any of you from Cornell, I apologize. And his motivation was to dump on the church, the Catholic Church, to give a good reason to keep people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe out of America. People like my grandfather who were coming and ruining the place. It was an anti-immigrant gizmo. In Europe, the same thing happened because in the growth of the city-state, the only power that was as big as the city-state was the church. So people like Bismarck would go out of their way to try to find reasons to dump on the church. And the anti-clerical Italian government the same way. There was a cardinal in Pisa who wanted to put up a statue to Galileo in the cathedral in Pisa, and the anti-clerical government wouldn't let him because that went against the propaganda they were putting out, the narrative they were putting out.
Well, and it's interesting. I think the other reason was also that science was pushing its way into the academy. And of course, most of the universities in this country were places of training clergy. So there was kind of an eviction of the clergy from the universities that happened over that period as well.
There's a lot of, well, I'm sounding like a Marxist now. There's a lot of economical reasons, economics reasons and social dynamics going into. One of the big ones was the eugenics movement. If you read popular literature of 1905, National Geographic has an article by Alexander Graham Bell, our favorite magazine with our favorite engineer, in favor of eugenics. It was the pop science of the day. And of course, it was horrible, not just bad science, because it doesn't work, but just horrible in that you're assuming you can come up with a one-dimensional way of these people are worthy of living and these people are not. And yet, the only organized group speaking out against it was religion. And the famous Scopes trial that everybody remembers, Inherit the Wind, and oh my gosh, if you read the textbook that Scopes was using in his high school, it was horrific, racist, nasty eugenics, and not a book that I would like to see being used in a high school. But people forget that because they wanted to draw these clear lines. These are the good guys, these were the bad guys. And the bad thing was, it also, if you're throwing up that evolution means eugenics to somebody who doesn't know any better, they're going to say, well, if that's the case, then the hell with evolution. And suddenly you've lost a generation of people who could have been great scientists. So it's self-defeating kind of argument in more ways than one.
I've got one card left here.
Okay.
It's a good one. What percentage of the world do you think we know?
Oh my goodness. The mathematician says you're dividing by infinity, so that would come out to be 0. I don't think it's quite that bad, but it's impossible to know. My father had this great image that he told me. I'm sure he stole it from someplace, but I'll give him credit for it. Knowledge is like an island. The more you know, the bigger your island. And you actually know these things, and it's true, and it is truth that you've got. And as your knowledge grows, your island does get bigger. But the bigger the island, the longer the shoreline of the boundary between what you know and what you don't know. So the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And if you know anybody who thinks they know it all, it's because their island is actually really small.
On that note, let's go
Thank
make
you all.
bigger islands.
And thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting the Exploratorium. And thank you for laughing at my terrible joke about Mass.
Thank you so much.